As I was driving home from work one night, I followed my usual route. It was around midnight, so the town was quite silent and uneventful. The roads were surrounded by forests and few houses, and I was cruising down a road with a cornfield on one side and a patch of woods on the other. The temperature was about 75 degrees, so I had the top down on my convertible, enjoying the warm summer breeze. Suddenly, I heard a woman scream that sounded like it was coming from one side of the road. I hit the brakes, quickly bringing the car to a halt, and listened attentively. There was another scream, and it was coming from the woods on the left side. The woman was crying out for help. I stepped out of the car and retrieved my baton from the back seat. I walked towards the woods, shouting to see if anyone was there. The woman responded immediately, begging for help. I ran into the woods, swiping aside any obstacles in my way. The woman would scream every 10 seconds or so, and I would approach her in that direction, running and screaming back. However, the further I went into the woods, the woman's screams didn't seem to get any closer or louder. They remained at the same distance, and I started to feel like I was walking into a trap. I yelled out, asking her to tell me where she was, and after about 5 seconds, the woman screamed out for help again. At this point, I felt uneasy and turned around, starting to run back to my car. I sprinted in the direction I had come from, not stopping until I could see the flashing headlights of my car on the side of the road beyond the trees. The woman's screams still echoed in my ears the whole way back, but they remained at the same distance, no matter how close I got to my car. It felt as though she were following me back. Was I being stalked? I quickly got into my car and drove out of there, completely freaked out. I called 911 to report the incident to the authorities, in case they wanted to investigate it. However, I wasn't sticking around there. After telling a few friends and family about the strange encounter, I was ready to move on with my life. However, a week later, I saw something on the news that made me sick to my stomach. The dead body of a woman in her 30s had been found in the woods by a man hiking with his dog. Oddly, there were no signs of foul play. The location where the body was found was in the same general area where I had heard the screams. While that patch of woods was very big, I couldn't help but feel that it was a huge coincidence. In another incident, I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to spend a weekend of snowboarding at my friend John's cabin. I had two cars at the time, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150, which I was driving on this particular night. I had my snowboarding gear in the bed of the truck, and it was around 10 p.m. when I was about 45 minutes from my buddy's cabin. The roads were pitch black, and it was snowing heavily, with no other cars on the road at that hour. Unfortunately, my truck frequently had problems, and that night was no exception. Perhaps at the worst possible time, the engine suddenly shut off. Was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to spend the weekend snowboarding at my friend John's cabin. I had two cars at the time, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150. On this particular night, I was driving the Ford with my snowboarding gear in the bed of the truck. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the roads were pitch black and snowy. There were no other cars on the road at that hour, except for me. Suddenly, my engine started to overheat and the needle went into the red zone. I pulled over to the side of the road and waited for it to cool down. I tried driving again at a slow speed, but the engine started to overheat again. I had to turn off the truck and couldn't diagnose the problem in the dark and snow. I had no reception for T-Mobile, so I couldn't even call for help. After waiting for about 10 minutes, a passing car finally came by. I had my hazards on and waved my arms, and the driver stopped. He had a small Toyota and asked what happened. I explained the situation and he asked if I was alone. After hesitating for a moment, I said yes. He handed me his cell phone, which had reception, and I called my friend John. John told me to call a specific towing company nearby, and he would come and pick me up. I gave him my location and he said he would head over. I called the towing company and requested assistance. The driver of the Toyota watched me the entire time. After my phone calls, I handed him back his phone and thanked him. After returning his phone, I thanked him. He responded with a "You're welcome," and drove off without further conversation, rolling up his window as he disappeared into the snowy darkness ahead. I watched as his taillights vanished completely while he descended below the peak of the hilly road above. Once again, I was alone. I climbed back into my idling truck for warmth and briefly turned off the headlights to gauge the darkness outside. It was pitch black, and I couldn't see even an inch beyond the windows. I waited in the truck, unable to do anything that required an internet connection. To pass the time, I played games on my phone for about 20 minutes until I heard a loud thud at my passenger side window. The sudden noise made me jump, and when I looked towards the window, I could only make out the vague outline of a person in the darkness outside. The headlights failed to fully illuminate the sides of my truck, and suddenly, a man's voice pierced through the darkness, begging for help. He yelled at me to open the door, claiming that he was freezing and stranded. I heard him trying to force the door open himself, but it remained locked. I shone my flashlight towards the window, but it barely helped me make out his silhouette. All I could see was someone in a large black coat with a hood over their head. I responded by asking what was wrong, and the mysterious man outside replied that he was lost and needed to escape the cold. However, I felt uneasy and nervous, trying to figure out how to verify his story and ensure my own safety. Before I could say anything, he began aggressively trying to open the locked door, pounding on the glass even harder while still screaming for help. In that moment, my instincts took over, and I decided to trust my gut. I put the truck in drive, and as he realized what I was doing, he started pounding on the window even harder, attempting to break it. Despite the potential damage to my overheating engine, I drove the truck onto the road, accelerating to 30 miles per hour. However, my heart skipped a beat as I approached the top of the hill on the road, catching a glimpse of a parked car with its tail lights reflecting in the darkness. Recognized the same Toyota that the man was driving earlier. I slowed down and rolled down my window to check if the man was inside, but there was nothing in sight. It appeared as if the car was empty. Looking out of the window for a moment, I noticed footprints in the snow behind the car, indicating that the man who had been pounding on my window was the one in the Toyota. He was trying to trick me into opening the door for some unknown purpose. Despite being aware that I was damaging my truck's engine, I continued to drive without stopping. A few minutes later, I pulled over when I saw headlights approaching from the opposite side of the road. When I realized that it was the tow truck, I was overjoyed and flashed my lights to signal him to pull over. The driver came out, and I quickly informed him about what had happened. He joked that he arrived just in time and inquired whether the man had a weapon, but I was unable to determine that. The driver responded, "We need to act fast," and it took him around 15 minutes to attach my truck to the tow truck. During this time, the Toyota did not pass us, so it was possible that the man had turned around and gone in the opposite direction, anticipating our actions. Using the tow truck driver's phone, I contacted John again and instructed him to meet us at the body shop. To summarize the rest of the events, John and I still. During that weekend, I went snowboarding, and the body shop repaired the broken water pump in my truck, which was causing it to overheat. A few weeks later, I sold the truck. I'm relieved that I didn't open my window or unlock the doors for the man who was trying to enter my car. In that setting, I could have been killed, and the perpetrator would have remained unknown. On a separate note, I had my first girlfriend when I was 17. At the time, I was living with my mother because my parents had divorced when I was 11. One day, I asked my girlfriend out on a date, and she agreed. We were both working day shifts at the time, with me at a local grocery store and her at a Starbucks. Additionally, we were both seniors in high school, and we didn't have much homework that day. Since it was a Friday, I decided to ask her out that day. After work, I picked her up from her house, and we went to a small restaurant located 10 minutes away from my house, as that was all I could afford at the time. After finishing our meal, we returned to her house to spend some time together. By that time, it had become dark outside, and my girlfriend complained that our date night was short. I told her that I couldn't take her anywhere else that required payment. We then agreed to go on a night drive, first driving around town and then along some empty roads in the woods. As we continued driving, we eventually reached the end of the pavement and found ourselves on a dirt road. I suddenly needed to pee, and my girlfriend did too. We pulled over and got out of the car, but as soon as we stepped outside, we were hit with a terrible and indescribable odor. I dismissed it as another person who had also pulled over to relieve themselves, but my girlfriend actually gagged from the smell. We quickly did our business in a small flat area nearby and planned to return to the car to continue our drive back into town. However, as we were heading back to the car, we heard a noise coming from the left side of us that sounded like a twig snapping. We were both frightened and quickly rushed back to the car. Just as we were about to open the car door, we heard a scream that sounded like someone was in fear or pain. The scream came from the direction where we had just relieved ourselves. I told my girlfriend to get into the car while I went to investigate. She begged me not to go, but I wanted to make her feel safer, so I locked the car doors and headed towards the source of the scream. I heard the scream again as I made my way there. I lost all my courage to investigate after hurting him, but when I heard a sound from the same direction where my girlfriend and I heard the twig snap, I didn't go there. Instead, I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and took a picture. As the flash went off, I saw a man in a white shirt with black stripes standing in front of some blue tarp. I didn't hesitate to run to my car, unlock the doors, get in, put it in drive, and floor it. My girlfriend asked me what happened, but I was too scared to explain. We returned to the shadier part of town, then went to her house. I showed her the picture of the man with the blue tarp, and she was just as creeped out as I was. Since it was Friday and we had no work or school, she let me spend the night. The scariest moment of my life occurred the following day. Although we were no longer in a romantic relationship, my best friend, who is 22, and I, at 23, were still very close. This happened in the late summer of 2011, when I was nearly 19 and my friend was a few years younger. We resided in a rural part of southwestern Virginia, roughly 15 minutes away from Mount Airy, North Carolina. The area shut down by 10 p.m., so we had to come up with our own ways to pass the time. Fortunately, we never had any trouble finding ways to enjoy ourselves. The evening began innocently enough. We went to the mall and then cruised the streets in search of girls, doing things that teenage guys typically do. However, when we were unsuccessful, we decided to go bowling until closing time. After that, we strolled through the back alleys of Main Street, thinking we were edgy badasses, but we didn't feel threatened as violent crime is rare in our area. When we grew bored, we headed to Waffle House for a bite to eat, as it was the only late-night dining option available at the time. We then made a quick stop at Walmart before the terrifying incident happened. We were not yet prepared to head back home, so we drove around some backcountry roads. Late-night drives were our thing, as you have to make your own fun around here. Though I had only driven on this particular stretch of road once during the day, it was not far from either of our homes. We just never had a reason to drive down it before. While the road was paved while still in Carolina, within a mile of entering Virginia, it turned into dirt like most of the dirt roads in the area. The county didn't pay much attention to it because it was so far out of the way, and there were very few houses on it. Since the road often washed out during heavy rain, we had to drive much slower. Even though we were more cautious now, it still seemed like any other road we would drive on at this time of night. The roads were essentially empty around this time. With just a few houses scattered along this road, we were confident that we wouldn't encounter any other traffic. The road was surrounded by dense woods and situated at the foot of a small mountain. At night, it was easy to miss the houses, but we noticed a light burning out of the corner of our eyes. As we both looked, we spotted a man standing motionless under the porch light. Although we couldn't make out his features, we could tell he was watching us. His demeanor made us uncomfortable, but we tried not to think too much of it, assuming he was just stepping out for a cigarette. Despite the man's unsettling presence, we continued down the road. But as we talked about him, our unease grew, and we picked up our pace. Soon, we reached the end of the road and returned to the familiar hardtop road that I drove once a week. Turning right, we felt relieved to leave the man behind us and speed up. As we traveled along the road, which runs along a small mountain ridge, we enjoyed the breathtaking scenery, grateful to have left the strange encounter behind us. After driving a couple of miles, we reached the end of a road that offered stunning views of the town below. Turning right, we made our way back to my house, taking a slightly more wooded road that I was even more familiar with, having driven or ridden it thousands of times before. As we headed back towards the main highway, we noticed something up ahead in the distant reaches of my headlights. Given the prevalence of deer in the area, we assumed it was just another one and slowed down. However, as we got closer, we realized it was much wider than the brown fur of a deer. Despite this, we still thought it might be an albino deer or some other animal. It wasn't until we were about 50 feet away from it that we saw it was actually a human figure, hunched over and walking in the left lane against traffic as one is supposed to. My friend asked what the hell she was doing walking at this time of night. As we drew nearer, we could make out the shape of an older-looking woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She still had her back turned to us until she turned around and we got our first look at her face. I can't say for certain that she was using meth or other drugs, but her appearance suggested otherwise. Her eye sockets were deep, with heavy dark bags underneath, her hair was greasy, and her skin appeared very aged. I estimated her age to be between mid-40s to late 50s, but that wasn't the worst of it. Suddenly, she threw her hands up in the air, started waving them frantically, and began running towards us. As she approached, we could see what looked like dried blood all over the front of her shirt and pants. In one of her hands, she was holding a large knife. We didn't know what she wanted, but our desire to be edgy badasses disappeared instantly. We quickly drove away, and didn't slow down until we reached the highway. We were so terrified by the experience that what should have been a quick 5-minute drive to my house turned into a 35-minute detour, just to make sure she wasn't following us. In small communities like ours, everyone pretty much knows each other, but neither of us had ever seen this woman before, and we never saw her again. We kept an eye on the local news for any reports of a bloody woman being arrested, but we never heard anything. It's difficult to imagine why she would be walking on the backcountry roads at almost 4 in the morning, given her condition with blood on her clothes and a knife in her hand. She faced the risks of human or animal altercation. Fast forward to present day, and I now live with my wife on that peaceful road on the mountain ridge, between the two roads of the incidents. I take the latter road almost daily, and still haven't seen any sign of that strange woman since. Just earlier this year, a large drug and cockfighting ring was busted down the road from the watching man's house. I don't know if it was the same house, or if those people were even living in the area back then. But after all that happened, I've often wondered if it was the same house. Maybe that guy was keeping guard on the place. As for the woman, I just hope I never run into her again.